My name is Julius Malema. Many people know me through politics. They know my speeches, my positions on social justice, African sovereignty, economic transformation, and the struggle for dignity among African people. Over the years, I have become accustomed to disagreement. In politics, disagreement is unavoidable. Different people see different solutions to the same problems. But this story is not primarily about politics. It is about leadership. It is about faith. It is about responsibility. And above all, it is about a question that many Africans continue to ask today. What role should the teachings of Jesus Christ play in the future of our continent? I decided to tell this story because I believe it contains lessons that extend far beyond Africa. Whether someone lives in South Africa, Burkina Faso, the United States, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, or anywhere else in the world, the challenges are often similar. People want honest leaders. They want justice. They want hope. They want a future where their children can live with dignity. In recent years, I have noticed that discussions about faith have become increasingly important. Across Africa, churches continue to grow. Millions of people gather every week to pray, worship, and seek guidance. Yet at the same time, many nations still struggle with poverty, corruption, conflict, and inequality. This raises difficult questions. Can faith transform society? Can political leaders genuinely serve the people while remaining true to moral principles? Can the values associated with Jesus Christ influence leadership in practical ways? These were not theoretical questions during the conversation I am about to describe. They became personal. The meeting took place around February of the year 2026 in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. A gathering of leaders, officials, and invited guests had brought together individuals from different parts of Africa to discuss regional challenges and opportunities. The official sessions were intense. Security concerns were discussed. Economic development was debated. The future of the Sahel region remained a major concern. Like many such meetings, there were prepared speeches, formal statements, and carefully structured discussions. But the most important moment happened after one of those sessions ended. During a break, I found myself walking into a private meeting room away from the main conference hall. There were no journalists present, no television cameras, no microphones recording every word, only a quiet room. Only a handful of assistants standing at a respectful distance. And inside that room was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. At first, I assumed we would exchange a few greetings and perhaps discuss regional matters for a few minutes before returning to the conference. I could not have imagined that what began as a casual conversation would eventually become one of the most memorable discussions of my life. What started as a simple exchange about Africa's future soon evolved into a direct and sometimes uncomfortable debate about power, conscience, leadership, and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Neither of us expected where the conversation would lead. Neither of us intended to challenge the other so deeply. Yet within minutes, the discussion took a direction that neither of us could ignore. And that is where the real story begins. As I mentioned earlier, the official session had just ended. The atmosphere throughout the conference center had been tense for most of the day. Leaders from different countries had spent hours discussing security concerns, economic pressures, and the growing challenges facing many regions of Africa. Everyone understood the importance of the discussions, but it was also clear that many difficult questions remained unanswered. During the break, people moved between meeting rooms, hallways, and private discussions. It was during that period that I entered a smaller room away from the main gathering. Inside, I saw Captain Ibrahim Traoré. A few assistants were present, but they remained at a distance. There was no crowd around us, no reporters waiting for a headline, no audience expecting a performance. For a moment, the room felt surprisingly quiet compared to the intensity outside. I greeted him respectfully. He returned the greeting. At first, the exchange was entirely ordinary. We spoke about the challenges facing the Sahel region. We discussed security concerns that continue to affect several African nations. We talked about economic development and the need for African countries to strengthen their ability to determine their own futures. These were subjects both of us knew well. As the conversation continued, I observed something interesting. Traoré appeared tired, not physically exhausted in a dramatic sense, but carrying the kind of fatigue that often comes with leadership. The burden of responsibility can be difficult to hide. Every leader knows that public decisions affect real people, real families, and real communities. Despite that weariness, his focus never seemed to drift. Whenever he spoke with intention. Whenever he listened carefully. I found that noteworthy. Many political conversations involve people waiting for their turn to speak rather than genuinely listening. This discussion felt different from the beginning. The more we talked about economic development, the more the discussion began moving toward a deeper question. What kind of leadership does Africa actually need? At first, neither of us stated the question directly. Instead, we approached it from different angles. We discussed why some nations possess enormous natural resources yet continue to struggle economically. We discussed why public trust in institutions often remains fragile. We discussed why citizens across the continent frequently express frustration with leaders who promise change but fail to deliver meaningful results. The conversation was no longer simply about budgets, policies, or security strategies. It was becoming a conversation about character. What qualities should define a leader? What responsibilities come with authority? What moral obligations accompany power? These questions slowly entered the discussion. As they did, I noticed that the tone of our exchange was changing. Neither of us seemed interested in offering the usual political answers. Instead, we began exploring the values that influence leadership itself. The conversation moved beyond government structures, beyond political parties, beyond military institutions, beyond election campaigns. It moved into the territory of ethics, conscience, and personal conviction. Looking back now, I believe that was the moment when the entire discussion changed direction. Neither of us could have known where it would eventually lead. What began as a conversation about regional challenges was becoming something much more personal. And before long, that shift would bring our first serious disagreement into the open. The respectful exchange that began in that quiet room was about to become a much more direct and challenging debate. The conversation had already moved far beyond economics and security. What began as a discussion about policies was gradually becoming a discussion about principles. As we continued speaking, I decided to raise a question that had been on my mind for many years. It was not a comfortable question. In fact, I knew it might create tension, but some questions are too important to avoid. I looked at Traoré and said that throughout Africa, many leaders regularly speak about God. They quote scripture in public speeches. They attend church services. They speak openly about faith and morality. Yet, despite all those public declarations, many nations continue to struggle with poverty, corruption, inequality, and poor governance. I asked him a simple question. If faith is so important to our leaders, why do so many citizens still feel abandoned? The room became noticeably quieter. I continued. I explained that one of my greatest concerns has always been the misuse of religion for political purposes. Across the world, not only in Africa, politicians sometimes discover that religious language can attract support. They learn that speaking about faith can inspire trust. But there is a difference between talking about faith and living according to its principles. I told him that when religion becomes a political tool, both politics and religion suffer. People lose confidence in leaders. people lose confidence in institutions. And sometimes they even lose confidence in the values they once believed in. Traoré listened carefully. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he paused briefly before responding. Then he offered a criticism of his own. He said that many politicians, including figures like myself, often spend so much time focusing on political power that they forget the spiritual dimension of leadership. His words were direct. He suggested that many leaders become experts at strategy, negotiation, and public messaging, but devote far less attention to questions of conscience and moral responsibility. According to him, power can become an obsession. When that happens, leaders begin measuring success by influence rather than service. I immediately challenged that view. I argued that political leadership requires practical solutions. Citizens need jobs, security, infrastructure, and opportunities. Governments cannot solve problems through good intentions alone. Traoré responded just as firmly. He agreed that practical action matters, but he insisted that practical action without moral foundations eventually loses its direction. The discussion quickly became more intense. Neither of us appeared interested in offering polite agreement simply for the sake of harmony. We challenged each other's assumptions. We questioned each other's perspectives. The debate remained respectful, but it was undeniably sharp. At several points, our voices grew stronger. Not because either of us was angry, but because both of us believed deeply in what we were saying. I argued that leaders must be judged by measurable outcomes. He argued that outcomes are often shaped by the values that guide decisions. I questioned whether public displays of faith automatically produce better leadership. He questioned whether political movements can remain effective if they neglect moral principles. Back and forth the discussion went. Neither side was willing to surrender the argument. What struck me most was that beneath our disagreement, both of us were wrestling with the same concern. How does Africa produce leaders who genuinely serve their people? The methods we emphasized were different. The priorities we highlighted were different. But the concern itself was shared. Still, at that moment, neither of us was ready to acknowledge that common ground. Instead, the debate continued to intensify, and soon it would move into an even more challenging phase, where we would begin confronting not only each other's arguments, but also the failures we saw throughout African leadership itself. By this stage, the conversation had become far more serious than either of us had expected. The polite exchange that began after the conference session was now a genuine debate about leadership, accountability, and the future of Africa. Neither of us was interested in protecting our own image. Neither of us was avoiding difficult subjects. And because of that, the discussion entered even more sensitive territory. After listening to Traoré's arguments about morality and leadership, I decided to raise a concern that many people around the world have whenever significant authority becomes concentrated in one individual. I told him that history contains many examples of leaders who began with good intentions. Some promised reform, some promised national renewal, some promised to defend their people against corruption and foreign influence. Yet, over time, power became increasingly centralized, criticism became less welcome, and institutions became dependent on one person rather than strong systems. I explained that this pattern had appeared in different countries throughout history. The danger, I said, is not always the character of a leader at the beginning. The danger often appears when a leader becomes surrounded by loyalty but no longer receives honest criticism. Authority without accountability can become a serious risk. I spoke directly. I said that military leadership carries particular responsibilities because citizens must trust that power is being exercised for the public good rather than personal interests. Traoré listened carefully. When I finished, He nodded slightly. Then he offered a response that was just as direct. He reminded me that many African nations had spent decades under traditional political systems. Those systems often included elections, political parties, government institutions, and constitutional structures. Yet, despite those arrangements, millions of Africans continued to face poverty, unemployment, corruption, and instability. His point was clear. He questioned whether traditional political leadership had truly delivered the results that citizens deserved. He argued that many political movements began with noble ideals, but gradually lost sight of their original mission. According to him, revolutionary language often sounds powerful at the beginning. People speak about justice. People speak about equality. People speak about serving the people. But over time, some leaders become more focused on preserving their position than fulfilling their promises. I immediately pushed back. I argued that failures within political systems should not be used to justify concentrating excessive authority elsewhere. Strong institutions remain essential. Independent voices remain essential. Open debate remains essential. Traoré responded by saying that institutions are only as effective as the people who lead them. A constitution cannot create integrity. A political party cannot manufacture character. A government office cannot guarantee honesty. Those qualities must come from individuals. The discussion intensified. We began referencing examples from different African countries. We discussed governments that had failed their citizens. We discussed leaders who entered office with enormous public support but eventually disappointed the people who trusted them. We discussed corruption scandals, broken promises, and missed opportunities. At times, it felt less like a debate between two individuals and more like a broader examination of Africa's modern history. Both of us were frustrated by different aspects of that history. Both of us believed that the continent deserved better, yet we disagreed about where the greatest dangers existed. I worried about concentrated power. He worried about ineffective political systems. I emphasized accountability. He emphasized character. Neither argument completely defeated the other. In fact, the more we challenged one another, the more complex the issue seemed to become. Leadership could not be reduced to a single formula. Neither military authority nor political authority automatically guarantees justice. Neither elections nor popular support automatically guarantee wisdom. The longer we spoke, the clearer it became that Africa's future would depend on something deeper than structures alone. It would depend on the values guiding the people who occupy positions of influence. At the time, however, we were still focused on exposing weaknesses in each other's arguments. Then, quite unexpectedly, Traoré asked a question that changed the entire direction of the discussion. It was a question that had nothing to do with elections, nothing to do with military strategy, nothing to do with government institutions. Yet it would become the most important question of the entire conversation, a question about Jesus Christ. After more than an hour of intense discussion, I assumed we would continue debating politics, governance, and leadership models. Up to that point, nearly everything we had discussed revolved around public responsibility and the challenges facing African nations. Then Traoré asked a question that completely changed the direction of the conversation. He looked at me and said quietly, "Do you truly believe in the teachings of Jesus?" For a few seconds, I said nothing. Not because I was offended, not because I was confused, but because it was not the question I expected. We had been discussing power, institutions, corruption, accountability, and leadership. Suddenly, the conversation shifted from political theory to personal conviction. The room became very still. Outside, the conference activities continued. People moved through hallways. Meetings resumed. Schedules continued. But inside that room, none of that seemed important at that moment. The question demanded reflection. I considered my answer carefully. Finally, I told him that people approach faith in different ways. Some express their beliefs openly. Others reflect on them privately. Some focus on religious traditions. Others focus on the moral principles those traditions teach. I explained that regardless of different interpretations, certain values remain universally important. Truth, justice, sacrifice, compassion, responsibility. These principles have influenced societies for generations. They continue to inspire people today, and many of those values are associated with the teachings of Jesus Christ. Traoré listened closely. Then he began speaking about Jesus in a way that surprised me. He did not focus on theology. He did not speak about religious denominations. He did not argue about doctrine. Instead, he focused on the example Jesus provided through his actions. He said that when he reflected on the life of Jesus, one image stood out above all others. Jesus consistently stood alongside ordinary people. He spoke to those who were ignored. He defended those who lacked power. He showed concern for those living on the margins of society. According to Traoré, this carried an important lesson for modern leaders. Leadership should not begin with protecting authority. Leadership should begin with serving people. As he spoke, I found myself considering his words carefully. The discussion was no longer about political systems competing against one another. It was becoming a conversation about the moral obligations of anyone entrusted with influence. I responded by saying that many leaders publicly admire the teachings of Jesus. Many quote scripture. Many speak about faith during campaigns and public appearances. The real challenge, however, is translating those ideals into daily decisions. It is one thing to praise sacrifice. It is another thing to make sacrifices. It is one thing to praise justice. It is another thing to defend justice when doing so carries personal cost. Traoré agreed immediately. For the first time during our discussion, there was no argument, no rebuttal, no attempt to challenge the other's position. Only agreement. He said that faith becomes meaningful when it influences behavior. Otherwise, it risks becoming a collection of words repeated without genuine commitment. I understood exactly what he meant. Across Africa, millions of people identify as Christians. Churches continue to grow. Religious gatherings attract enormous crowds. Yet many communities still struggle with corruption, dishonesty, and inequality. The contradiction is impossible to ignore. That realization led us into a deeper discussion. Instead of asking whether Christianity was growing, we began asking whether its values were being practiced. Instead of discussing religious identity, we began discussing moral transformation. The debate that started with politics had now entered the territory of faith. And for the first time that afternoon, we were no longer standing on opposite sides of the discussion. We were beginning to search for common ground. The question was no longer whether faith mattered. The question was what genuine faith should look like in the life of a leader. That question would lead us directly into a broader discussion about the state of Christianity across Africa and the challenges facing believers today. Once the discussion turned toward faith, the tone in the room changed noticeably. The earlier debate had been intense, sometimes sharp, and often confrontational. Now the conversation became more reflective. Neither of us was trying to win an argument. Instead, we were trying to understand a reality that affects hundreds of millions of people across Africa. I remember looking out toward the conference grounds for a moment and thinking about how much the continent had changed during the past several decades. Across Africa, Christianity has experienced extraordinary growth. From large cities to remote villages, churches have become part of everyday life for countless families. Every week, millions gather to pray, worship, read scripture, and seek guidance for their lives. Faith is not merely a private matter for many Africans. It influences communities. It shapes families. It affects the way people understand hope, suffering, responsibility, and purpose. Traoré acknowledged this reality immediately. He said that no serious discussion about Africa's future could ignore the role faith plays in the lives of ordinary people. I agreed. The influence of Christianity across the continent is impossible to deny. Yet as we continued talking, another reality became equally impossible to ignore. Growth in religious participation does not automatically produce moral transformation throughout society. I said something that both of us recognized as true. A nation can have more churches than ever before and still struggle with corruption. A politician can quote scripture and still make dishonest decisions. A public official can attend worship services and still fail to serve the people faithfully. The existence of faith communities does not guarantee ethical leadership. Traoré nodded. He then added a point that remained with me long after the conversation ended. He said that faith should not be measured only by what happens inside the church building. It should also be measured by what happens outside it. How people treat their neighbors, how leaders treat their citizens, how institutions treat the vulnerable, how individuals respond when faced with temptation, pressure, and opportunity. His observation was simple yet powerful. Faith becomes visible through action. Without action, declarations of belief remain incomplete. For the second time during our conversation, we found ourselves in complete agreement. We both recognize that Africa does not merely need more discussions about morality. Africa needs leaders who demonstrate morality through their decisions. Africa needs citizens who uphold integrity even when nobody is watching. Africa needs institutions guided by principles rather than personal interests. The more we talked, the clearer it became that faith and leadership cannot be separated entirely. Whether someone is religious or not, leadership always reflects certain values. Every decision reveals priorities. Every action reveals character. Every choice communicates what a leader truly believes. I told Traoré that one of the greatest dangers facing any society is the gap between public declarations and private behavior. When leaders say one thing but do another, trust begins to disappear. And once trust is lost, rebuilding it becomes extremely difficult. He agreed. Trust, he said, is one of the most valuable resources any nation possesses. Without trust, citizens become cynical. Without trust, institutions weaken. Without trust, even good policies struggle to succeed. For much of our earlier discussion, we had focused on our disagreements. Now we were discovering common concerns. Neither of us believed that faith should be reduced to slogans. Neither of us believed that religious identity alone guarantees moral leadership. And neither of us believed that Africa's challenges could be solved through speeches alone. What mattered was the practical application of values: honesty, responsibility, service, humility, justice. Those principles mattered far more than public appearances. As the conversation continued, I realized something important. This was the first moment that afternoon when we were no longer debating the problem. We were beginning to discuss the solution. That naturally led me to ask a question that would push the conversation even further. If faith and character are so important, then what exactly should an African leader look like? What qualities should define a leader who genuinely serves the people? I decided to ask Traoré directly. His answer would become one of the most memorable parts of our entire discussion. By this point, the atmosphere in the room was very different from when our conversation had begun. The sharp exchanges and disagreements had not disappeared completely, but they had given way to something more constructive. We had spent a long time discussing problems. Now, I wanted to talk about solutions. So I looked at Traoré and asked him a direct question. If a leader wants to serve the people in a way that honors the values often associated with the teachings of Jesus, what kind of person should that leader be? He did not answer immediately. For a few moments, he reflected carefully. Then he spoke with a level of clarity that caught my attention. He said that the first responsibility of any leader is to serve the people before serving himself. According to him, leadership should never be viewed primarily as a privilege. It should be viewed as a duty. A leader who becomes obsessed with personal comfort, personal wealth, or personal prestige eventually loses sight of the very people he was entrusted to serve. As he spoke, I thought about how often history has demonstrated this truth. Many leaders begin their journey promising to help ordinary citizens. Yet, once power arrives, priorities sometimes change. The needs of the people become secondary. Personal interest become primary. The consequences can be devastating. Traoré continued. He said that a leader should live simply. He was not suggesting that leaders must live in poverty. His point was different. He believed leaders should remain connected to the realities experienced by ordinary citizens. A leader who becomes isolated from the struggles of the people will eventually make decisions that fail to address those struggles. Distance creates misunderstanding. Humility creates understanding. That observation resonated with me. One of the greatest dangers facing leadership is becoming disconnected from everyday life. When leaders stop listening to workers, farmers, teachers, small business owners, and families, they begin governing from assumptions rather than reality. Traoré then mentioned a third quality, responsibility. He said that true leaders accept accountability when things go wrong. They do not spend all their time blaming predecessors, opponents, or external forces. While circumstances certainly matter, leadership requires the courage to accept responsibility for decisions and outcomes. Again, I found myself agreeing. Accountability is not a sign of weakness. It is often a sign of maturity. A leader who cannot admit mistakes will struggle to learn from them. After listening carefully, I decided to add my own thoughts. I told him that a leader must be willing to hear opposing viewpoints. This is not always easy. Criticism can be uncomfortable. Disagreement can be frustrating. Yet leaders who surround themselves only with supporters risk losing touch with reality. Sometimes the people who challenge us provide insights we need most. A healthy society requires open dialogue. It requires the ability to listen even when we disagree. Traoré acknowledged that point. Then I added another principle. A leader must place the interests of the nation above personal ambition. Power should never become the ultimate goal. If leadership becomes merely a pathway to influence, status, or control, the public eventually pays the price. The purpose of leadership should be service, not self-preservation, not personal glory, service. For the first time during our entire conversation, it felt as though we were building something together rather than debating against one another. The differences between us had not disappeared. We still viewed many political issues differently, but we were discovering common values: service, humility, responsibility, accountability, listening, integrity. These principles transcended political labels. They transcended ideologies. And perhaps most importantly, they reflected qualities that many people associate with the example Jesus provided through his life. As I listened to Traoré and reflected on my own words, I realized that our conversation had reached an important turning point. We were no longer discussing what was wrong with leadership. We were describing what leadership should become. Yet after such a long and intense discussion, something unexpected happened. The room fell silent. Neither of us had anything immediate to add. And in that silence, both of us began reflecting on our own responsibilities, our own countries, and the future of the continent we both care deeply about. After everything we had said, the room became unexpectedly quiet. It was not an awkward silence. It was the kind of silence that follows something important when both people need time to absorb what has just been discussed. We had spent more than an hour moving through difficult topics. We had argued about power. We had challenged each other's views on leadership. We had spoken about faith, responsibility, and the values that shape societies. Now, for the first time, neither of us felt the need to continue speaking. I remember turning slightly toward the window. Outside, the light over Ouagadougou was changing. The afternoon was ending, and the city was slowly moving into evening. There was a calmness in the atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the intensity of our earlier debate. Traoré stood quietly beside me. He was no longer speaking as a military leader in a political discussion, and I was no longer speaking as a political figure engaged in argument. In that moment, we were simply two men reflecting on the weight of leadership. I found myself thinking about South Africa. Not the political speeches or the public debates, but the people, the workers who wake up early every morning, the families trying to build a better life, the young people searching for opportunity and direction. I thought about the expectations they place on leaders. And I thought about how often those expectations are not fully met. At the same time, I could sense that Traoré was reflecting on his own country. Burkina Faso carries its own history, its own challenges, and its own hopes. Leadership in such a context is never simple. Every decision carries consequences that extend far beyond the present moment. The silence between us was filled with thought rather than emptiness. It felt like both of us were reviewing everything we had just said, not to find flaws in the other person's argument, but to examine our own assumptions. Moments like that are rare in political life. Most discussions are designed to produce answers quickly. Most environments demand immediate positions, immediate responses, immediate conclusions. But real understanding often requires something different. It requires pause. It requires reflection. It requires the willingness to sit with complexity without rushing to simplify it. Neither of us broke the silence for several minutes. The world outside continued as normal, but inside that room, time felt slower. Eventually, I realized something important. Despite all our disagreements earlier, we had both been searching for the same thing. We wanted leaders who do not lose themselves in power. We wanted systems that serve people rather than control them. We wanted societies where dignity is not reserved for a few, but shared by many. We just approached those desires from different directions. Traoré finally spoke, but his words were quiet. He said that Africa does not lack potential. It lacks consistency in leadership values. I did not respond immediately because I understood what he meant. Potential is everywhere. Resources are everywhere. Ideas are everywhere. But consistency in values is what determines whether potential becomes reality. We stood there for a while longer, looking out at the city, thinking about what comes next for our countries, not in terms of competition, but in terms of responsibility. Eventually, the silence came to an end when the outside world began calling us back into the schedule of the conference. But something had changed. The conversation had left a mark that neither of us could ignore. And as I prepared to leave the room, I understood that what had happened there was not just a debate. It was a moment of reflection that would stay with me long after the meeting ended. When the silence finally broke, it was not because the discussion had been exhausted. It was because reality was calling us back. The conference schedule was continuing. People were waiting. Responsibilities had to be resumed. But what had happened in that room stayed with both of us as we prepared to return to the wider gathering. Before we left, our conversation naturally returned to the central theme that had shaped the latter part of our discussion: Jesus Christ, not as a figure of political debate, not as a symbol used for public messaging, but as a reference point for values that influence leadership and society. Traoré spoke first. He said that when he looks at Africa, he does not see a continent lacking resources. He does not see a continent lacking capable people. He does not see a continent lacking ideas or energy. What he sees, he said, is a deeper challenge, a challenge of consistency in moral direction. In other words, Africa often knows what is right, but struggles to apply it consistently over time. I listened carefully to that observation because it reflected something I had also witnessed throughout my years in public life. Many nations make strong commitments. Many leaders deliver powerful speeches. Many institutions design ambitious plans. Yet over time, implementation becomes uneven. Promise fad. Systems weaken. Trust declines. Traoré connected this directly to the values often associated with Jesus: honesty, humility, service, compassion, justice. He suggested that these are not only religious values, they are also governance principles. Any society that consistently applies these principles will naturally become more stable and more just. I responded by agreeing that these values are widely respected even beyond religious communities. People may differ in belief systems, but most societies recognize the importance of fairness, integrity, and compassion. The challenge is not recognition. The challenge is practice. It is one thing to admire those values. It is another thing to institutionalize them, to make them part of decision-making, part of leadership culture, part of everyday governance. As we spoke, I began to reflect on something deeper. Across Africa, Christianity continues to grow in influence. Churches play an important role in communities. Religious leaders often provide guidance, support, and structure for millions of people. Yet the existence of strong faith communities alone has not eliminated corruption or inequality. This contradiction cannot be ignored. Traoré acknowledged this as well. He said that faith without action risks becoming symbolic rather than transformative. And symbolism alone cannot change material conditions. At that point, our conversation became less about critique and more about reflection. We were no longer trying to analyze failure. We were trying to understand responsibility. What does it mean for a leader to claim faith? What does it mean for a society to be deeply religious, yet still struggle with injustice? What does it mean for values to be widely preached but inconsistently practiced? These were not easy questions, but they were necessary ones. I said that one of the greatest risks in any society is the gap between belief and behavior. When that gap becomes too large, credibility collapses. And when credibility collapses, institutions struggle to function effectively. Traoré agreed. He added that trust is the foundation of any functioning society. Without trust, cooperation weakens. Without trust, governance becomes fragile. Without trust, even well-designed systems struggle to succeed. As we approached the end of our discussion, it became clear that we had reached a shared conclusion. Faith matters, but it must be lived. Leadership matters, but it must be grounded in service. Values matter, but they must be consistent. At that moment, Jesus was no longer part of a debate between two political figures. He had become a reference point for a broader conversation about how leaders should behave and how societies should function. Not as doctrine being enforced, but as an example being considered. And as we prepared to leave the room, I realized something important. Our disagreement had not disappeared, but it had transformed. It was no longer centered on opposition. It was centered on understanding. And That understanding would lead us into the final part of this conversation, where words would turn into something simpler, yet more powerful than argument. The assistant's voice eventually interrupted the quiet rhythm of our conversation. The next session was about to begin. Time, as it always does in political gatherings, had moved forward without waiting for reflection to finish. We both understood that the discussion could not continue indefinitely, but neither of us left the room immediately. There was a final moment that needed to happen, a moment that did not require speeches, a moment that did not require arguments, a moment that only required acknowledgement. I turned to Traoré and extended my hand. He did the same. We shook hands. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simple, but it carried the weight of everything we had discussed. We had disagreed on many points. We still saw certain political realities differently. We still came from different experiences and different perspectives, but we had reached an understanding that went beyond disagreement. We both recognized that leadership in Africa cannot be reduced to ambition, ideology, or authority alone. It must be grounded in something deeper: service to people, responsibility for decisions, and a commitment to values that protect human dignity. As we held that handshake, Traoré spoke quietly. He said that we may disagree on many things, but we should never disagree on the responsibility to serve the people. Those words stayed with me because they were not political. They were human. I nodded in agreement. And in that moment, there was nothing left to argue about. Only something left to carry forward. As I walked out of that room, I reflected on everything that had been said, the arguments, the criticisms, the questions, the moments of silence, and the unexpected shift toward faith and reflection. What I understood most clearly was this: that conversation was not about winning or losing a debate. It was about recognizing the standards we claim to believe in and measuring ourselves against them honestly. In public life, it is easy to speak about values. It is much harder to live them consistently. But that is exactly where leadership is tested. Not in speeches, not in conferences, but in the daily decisions that affect real people. As I left the building in Ouagadougou, I carried a simple realization with me. Africa's future will not be determined only by systems or structures. It will be determined by the character of those entrusted with responsibility and by whether those individuals are willing to align their actions with the values they publicly declare. The conversation with Ibrahim Traoré did not erase our differences, but it reminded me of something more important. That beyond politics, beyond ideology, and beyond position, there is a shared obligation to serve humanity with integrity. And that is the lesson I took from that day. A lesson not written in policy, not delivered in a speech, but spoken quietly between two leaders in a room where, for a brief moment, honesty mattered more than anything else. After that meeting in Ouagadougou, I did not immediately return to my usual way of thinking. Some conversations end when the words stop. This one did not. It followed me, not as a political memory, but as a personal reminder. I thought about everything we had said, about power, about responsibility, about the gap between what leaders promise and what they deliver. And most of all, about faith. Not faith as a slogan, but faith as a standard of behavior. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting more deeply on how easily leadership can drift away from its original purpose. Many systems begin with ideals. Many movements begin with hope. Many leaders begin with sincerity. But over time, pressure changes priorities. Survival becomes strategy. Strategy becomes self-protection. And self-protection can slowly replace service. That is how trust begins to weaken. And once trust is damaged, Even good intentions struggle to restore it. What stayed with me most from the conversation with Ibrahim Traoré was not our disagreement. It was the moments where disagreement turned into clarity. We did not solve Africa's problems in that room. No two people could. But we did identify something important. That leadership without moral grounding is incomplete, and that moral language without moral action is empty. Across Africa today, faith remains strong in many communities. People pray with sincerity. People gather with hope. People seek meaning in difficult circumstances. But societies are not transformed by words alone. They are transformed when those words become behavior. When leaders act with honesty even when it is inconvenient. When institutions choose fairness over advantage. When responsibility is carried even when it is heavy. That is where change becomes real. I also realized something else. Despite coming from very different political perspectives, Ibrahim Traoré and I shared a concern that is rarely spoken about clearly. We both understood that Africa's greatest challenge is not a lack of ideas. It is not a lack of talent. It is not even a lack of resources. It is consistency. Consistency in leadership, consistency in values, consistency in applying principles even under pressure. That is what determines whether nations move forward or remain stuck in cycles of disappointment. When I think back to that meeting room, I do not remember slogans. I do not remember arguments. I remember silence. Because in that silence, something became clear. That beyond political identity, beyond ideology, beyond institutions, human beings are still searching for the same things. Dignity, justice, truth, and hope. These are not abstract concepts. They are daily needs for individuals, for families, for entire nations. If there is one conclusion I can draw from that conversation, it is this. Change does not begin with perfect systems. It begins with people who choose to act differently. People who refuse to separate what they believe from what they do. People who understand that leadership is not defined by authority but by responsibility. And perhaps most importantly, people who recognize that values are only meaningful when they are lived consistently, not only spoken. That is the lesson I carry with me from that day in Ouagadougou. Not as a political statement, but as a human reflection, a reminder that even in disagreement, there can be understanding. And even in leadership, there must always be accountability to something greater than power itself.